So many thanks to Anna and also to Christina for inviting me to speak, and for Anna also for meticulously organising the details of my visit. And there is a Warwick connection to all of this. So my talk is based on a chapter that I've written for a collection that one of the editors is Stefano Bellin. Do you know him? Yes, so he was here for 3 years as a postdoc. And this collection now is coming out. The manuscript is with Liverpool University Press, and it's a story collection, Judith Butler, Michael Rothberg. So it's going to be a really interesting and quite a hard-hitting collection, I would say. And this talk is based on my chapter for that. Levi Beyond Levi. That's the title. So, and I've met up with Stefano, and he's been enormously helpful for me to get this topic. As you'll see, it's quite a unique topic, and I needed his help. I sincerely hope that my talk will reflect the values of the Warwick Centre for Global Jewish Studies, not least as Anna is the director, in bringing together suffering communities globally. And that's the thrust of the talk. I'm conscious that in Germany, where Christine now is, bringing a decolonial perspective to the history of testimony can be accused of relativizing the Holocaust. But if that is the case, as we'll see, Primo Levi can also be accused of relativizing. So there's 3 strands to my talk, and I think we now need to go into the first slide. Perfect. 3 strands: the comparison between Douglas's and Levi's testimonies. So that will be the first kind of strand of what I'm talking about. Levi's experience of slavery. And this is what is unusual. No one before my article spoke about Levi and slavery, whereas Levi himself spoke about it all the time in his testimonies, his essays, his fiction, absolutely everywhere. And we checked this both in the Italian collected edition and the English, just to make sure. And then the final strand of the talk will be commonalities, how by bringing Levi and Douglas together, 2 iconic figures in relation to testimony, what we can learn from that and how we can think of testimony today in relation to bringing them together. And I call the talk Decolonizing Testimony, and I use the essays by Wole Soyinka, who makes out a case for testimony going back to the transatlantic slavery. And I'll explain why that is a counter-narrative to the narrative that we normally think of. We'll think of some general issues, especially the relationship between the individual and the collective. So what is lost when we just look at individuals? What is the relationship between the individual testimonies and more collective or collected testimonies? We'll look at questions of the gender. So my book will be about testimony as a genre across time and space. That's how I'm thinking about the book. And we'll look at how that is gendered as well. We'll look at expectations. What do we expect when we read and think about testimony? And as I say, the relationship between history and the present testimony today. Okay, so let's move to the next slide. And the one after that. So we're looking now at hard and soft definitions of testimony. Now, testimony is one of those genres which has many meanings and can move in several different directions at once. The hard definition of testimony is on the side of the world, history, fact, and objectivity. After all, eyewitness testimony is presented routinely in a court of law. And we'll see that both Douglas and Levi, their testimonies were used in a hard legal way. But testimony is also an account of a life in extremis and strays into the self, the literary, and the subjective or the autobiographical perceptions. So that's a softer definition of testimony. So if the way of thinking of testimony, or the way that I think of testimony, is that, if you like, a spectrum from hard definitions to soft and back again. In other words, testimony combines memory and mourning. It gives a voice to the individual survivor, but is also at pains to represent the vast majority who cannot speak for themselves. My point is that for Levi and Douglas, there was an expectation by their mainly white Christian readers, and I think the question of genre, the question of readerly expectations, the constructed reader, all of these, I think, are relevant questions. And certainly they both faced an expectation that they would conform to the hard definition of testimony. And as I say, slave narratives were part of a legal campaign to abolish slavery, and Holocaust survivors were often witnesses in courts of law, although they were distrusted in West Germany as late as the 1970s. One reason for that distrust is that quite often solicitors or judges were ex-Nazis, but let's not go there. But it's not until recent times, the 1980s and 1990s, that historians have included slave narratives or Holocaust testimonies as trustworthy evidence in their accounts. And there are now a number of prominent examples of the use of testimonies wholesale in books. One of them is Anna's book, The Last Ghetto. Another is a book by Christopher Browning on a slave labor camp that is just based on testimonies. Now, I think fairly prominent Holocaust historians, someone like Don Stone, will use testimonies. So there was a great deal of distrust, as I say, up until the 80s and 90s. Now, we'll look at the two quotes on the slides. They're designed to show the spectrum of hard and soft definitions used by Douglas and Levi. So the first one is taken from the original introduction to his second testimony. And this is written by a friend of Douglas's. James Smith was the first African American to earn a medical degree. But here he's addressing generic expectations in his introduction. So you can see here that he says, it's been said of Mr. Douglas, it talks about his descriptive and declamatory powers. Douglas was a very skilled writer. The highest order, they take precedence over his logical force. Memory, logic, wit, sarcasm, invective, pathos, and bold imaginary. So we have here the divide between logic and the imaginary. So he's giving you all different versions of what testimony could be in relation to Douglas's testimonies. And we'll see that the white abolitionist had completely different expectations of Douglas. And we'll look at that. I will look at that when I look at Douglas's work. Primo Levi constantly striving to go beyond bare witnessing. So bare witnessing is a factual account of their experience. So this is the kind of account that you would give in a court of law. Levi wants to go beyond that. And quite a number of writers deliberately say, the last thing I want to do is give a boring factual account. I mean, the problem is, if you're writing a testimony and you just give the facts, you just give a documentary account, then you're not going to have many readers. It's dull. So you have to create a narrative that's engaging for readers, if you want a mass readership, rather than historical evidence. And here we'll see some kind of tension. So he wants to go beyond bare witnessing, rich hybrids of neutral record and literary elaboration. So again, we have neutral record, literary elaboration. We have hard and soft versions of testimony. Levy's testimony is a layering of truth from fact to reflection, from court deposition to writerly composition. So here we see just the range of testimonies. And these particular writers very much are self-conscious about the of what testimony, of the hard definition of testimony, and want to expand that. But we'll see, they are exceptional writers. Okay, let's go for slide 6. So the next one. So why do we need to decolonize testimony, and what does that mean? To decolonize means many things, from the history of colonialism, the literal decolonization after World War II, to the overthrowing of all forms of colonial inheritance. For the purposes of my talk, I want to focus on the way in which the concept of decolonization helps us to move from historical understanding that begins and ends on the European continent. When it comes to testimony, as I say, the renowned Nigerian writer, Nobel Prize winner, Wale Soyinka, is one of many voices that cannot understand why the Holocaust, rather than the Atlantic slave trade, has been highlighted as the contemporary symbol of barbarism, supposedly at the margins of Western civilization. And this is what he's saying in this quote. So this is a quote from his collection of essays, The Burden of Memory. He says, "I've railed against the thesis that it was the Jewish Holocaust that placed the first question mark on all claims of European humanism. Insistence on that thesis merely provides further proof that the European mind has yet to come into full cognition of the African world as an equal sector of a universal humanity. For if it had, its historic recollection would have placed the failure of European humanism centuries earlier, and it would be at the very inception of the Atlantic slave trade." So this is my starting point for trying to open up and globalize what we think of as testimony. So what he's saying is, if we want to bring together civilization and barbarism, why not begin with the slave trade? Okay, let's move on to slide 7. Now, the early 1990s saw the publication of Shoshana Feldman's and Dari Loeb's book, Testimony, Crisis of Witnessing. The cover's covered up. It doesn't matter. Do you know this book? Yeah, I mean, yes. Do you know it? Okay. It's a fairly standard book. It's still, it remains one of the most influential today, I think, on testimony. But I think we need to think about their claims. I think we now need to move this over. I'm sorry. We need to think. So it's the pictures being covered up doesn't matter. My son always tells me I don't use enough pictures in my slides. Okay. So it's one of the most influential books, but their claim, and this is very much a 1990s claim, and 1990s was the period of Oslo. People thought there'd be peace in the Middle East. It was a period of optimism, the end of apartheid, Tony Blair coming into power, Northern Ireland peace, very, very different to what we have now. So this is how they think of testimony. They say it's the literary or discursive mode par excellence of our times, and that can precisely be defined as the age of testimony. The age of testimony. Now, this claim follows Elie Wiesel, who, whereas Primo Levi, I think, is the iconic Auschwitz survivor in Europe, Elie Wiesel has that dubious status in the United States. So Wiesel's characterization of Holocaust testimony as what he calls a new literature, which now this all made sense in the 1970s when the voice of Holocaust survivors needed to be heard, as I said, They were ignored even by Holocaust historians, but not by the 1990s, when other voices, I think, also needed to be heard. So this is Wiesel's famous statement. There are the witnesses, there is their testimony. If the Greeks invented tragedy, the Romans, the epistle, and the Renaissance, the sonnet, our generation invented a new literature, that of testimony, a new literature. We've all been witnesses, and we all feel that we have to bear testimony for the future. So this was a lecture given in 75. And this is who feeds into, and Fellman quote this when they talk about the age of testimony. But what is missing from Fellman and Laub, however, is the long history of testimony, its theological and judicial origins. So it's very much part of the Christian tradition, especially, and law, which in their book has been superseded. So the old versions of testimony have been superseded by this new literature, as they put it, this new genre or epoch. So it's not surprising, given such supersessionism, that the so-called age of testimony ignores chattel slavery in North America and throughout the world. But testimony is far from a new genre. It derives from the Latin for witness, testis, which is why witnessing and testifying is a form of knowledge. There's also a connection between testimony and the etymology of martyr, which comes from the Greek martyr, or witness, and as I say, is at the heart of Christian theology. Bearing witness in religious terms means commemorating a transcendent truth. Now, when we add the radical South American tradition of testimonio, and this is the third quote, we can see that the age of testimony has a global reach. Testimonio is a new form of narrative literature in which we can witness and be part of an emerging culture linked closely to national liberation movements and other social struggles. So both Beverly and Wiesel argue that testimony is new, is wholly new, whereas Wiesel is concerned to give a voice to the victims. Beverly focuses on testimony in Latin America as a form of collective public action, a defined deposition against crime, against evil. And this form of testimony is now very much coming out of Gaza. It's also coming out of a lot of the survivors and victims of October the 7th. So both on the Israeli side and the Palestinian side. And we'll see, the point is that these two suffering communities are at the moment not in any way communicating, but Edward Said's point, he called this a counterpoint, is that the victims on both sides and communities of uncommunicating suffering at some point need to talk to each other. And that at the moment is the hardest thing. So we have here testimony as a form of political action, testimony here as a form of closed, exceptional genre, and the age of testimony being, I think, quite narrowly defined. So that's my starting point for all of this. Okay. I'm sure we have to move on. Yes, slide 9. So there's a couple of clicks. So the first will be saying Frederick Douglass. Okay. So now I'm going to talk about Frederick Douglass. Yeah, so it's 9, number 9. Okay, sorry. Am I being too slow, do you think? Great, okay, fantastic. Yeah, great, okay. Now, Frederick Douglass was born Frederick Bailey in Maryland in 1818, although he didn't know his actual birth date for many decades. He was the son of the slave Harriet Bailey. His father's widely thought to be Harriet's white slave master, Aaron Anthony. After being raised in relative comfort by his grandmother, he was taken at the age of 6 to a slave plantation to be with his siblings. He managed to persuade his master's wife to teach him to read and write until his master objected. Now, those enslaved weren't even allowed access to the Bible. They were deliberately kept illiterate, which is why most slave narratives are written by a white abolitionist, but not Douglass. So Douglass is exceptional in that sense, that there were very few. There was about 100 slave narratives written at around this period before the American Civil War. He writes in his own voice. He ends up working in a shipyard at the age of 10 to 12. And because of his continued learning, including the secretive reading of the Bible and also abolitionist newspapers, he was sent back to Maryland under the cruel authority of Edward Covey. Now, Edward Covey was a notorious so-called breaker of slaves. But at the age of 16, Douglass famously fought Covey to a standstill, which was a major turning point in his life. As he recounts, and this is the first of three testimonies. So this is the first testimony, this is the second one, and this is the third. I'm going to be dealing with the first two. So as he says in his first two testimonies, in the first testimony, fighting Covey to a standstill, quote, was a glorious resurrection from the tomb of slavery to the heaven of freedom. Here Douglass knowingly becomes, in this testimony, a Christ figure, resurrected in humanist terms, and quoting, "You have seen how a man was made a slave. You shall now see how a slave was made into a man." After fighting Covey, he remained merely what he called a slave in form, and escaped to Philadelphia 4 years later. 3 years after that, age 23, he became a regular speaker for the American Anti-Slavery Society, which I'll call AASS, the American Anti-Slavery Society in Massachusetts. Some of his best-known lectures are, so these were various lectures that he's given. What to the slave is the 4th of July? So he talks about the 4th of July in relation to being a slave. There's a scientific lecture here, the claims of the Negro ethnographically considered. So he brings in science. And the other famous lecture of his is the trials and triumphs of self-made men. Self-made men. So he very much uses a kind of American ideology of being an independent, self-made man. The first testimony, as I say, ends at the point in which he changes from a witness to his suffering and a witness to slavery to becoming an advocate. His second testimony, My Bondage and My Freedom, the second one, written 10 years later, is where he finds his own voice beyond the mainly white anti-abolitionist movement. And when he finds his own voice, he writes a novel, he sets up a newspaper, he also has a monthly. So he becomes very much, because the first slave narrative was very much a bestseller, and he becomes a kind of well-known figure, he finds his own voice and speaks in his own voice soon after that. The point here is that Douglass spoke in a variety of forms and styles, from fiction to science and all points in between. So we're looking again at this kind of range from science to fiction writing. Okay, let's move on. So slide 10. So the link with Levi and Douglass is that we'll see both encompass a variety of perspectives and vocabularies to understand and testify to their experiences, as we'll see, from antiquity and medieval thinking to the modern economy. Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American slave, written by himself, and the title here is important, was the first best-selling slave narrative published in 1845, after Harriet Beecher Stowe's 1852 novel, Uncle Tom's Cabin. It was the most influential publication which made out a case for the abolition of slavery in the years leading up to the American Civil War. Douglas's narrative was one of more than 100 such fugitive slave narratives published between the 1840s and the emancipation in 1865 as part of the abolitionist movement. And they're called fugitive slave narratives because he was literally on the run. He could have been arrested at any time, even in North America. Now, the title is significant. He's described as an American slave, which reinforced his split identity as a would-be citizen, the outlaw Douglas, and dehumanized human being, the child slave Bailey. His narrative was unusual, written by himself, as I've said, indicated in the title, which signifies his free expression, and most narratives, as I've said, were ghost-written. But like all slave narratives, it was circumscribed by William Lloyd Garrison's long preface, and Garrison was one of the leaders of the abolitionist movement. And what Garrison said was, you know, in his opinion, it was true. You know, they had a long preface saying all of this. There was also a letter from the prominent abolitionist Wendell Phillips, and both of which Douglas studiously qualified in the second testimony, but he needed it in the first testimony. Many of Douglas's early lectures comprised of readings from Theodore Wells' Slavery as It Is. So here it is, Slavery as It Is, Testimony of 1,000 Witnesses. Now, this book was a large collection illustrating the barbarity of slavery, taken from around 20,000 newspaper clippings and writings by slaveholders. In their preface to the volume, the AASS made clear its orthodoxy. So this is the quote. So the preface to the volume. The value of testimony is by no means measured by the novelty of the horrors which is described, but that of corroborative testimony, facts, similar to those established by others, is highly valuable. So you can see here the orthodoxy. It's facts they want. It's not the novelty of horrors or the telling the story of horrors. And it's corroborative facts. So this is the language of law. This is the language of courts of law. Douglas was asked when speaking on behalf of the AASS to display his scars. So he was whipped, he had scars, and he had to speak in an accent. He had quite an educated accent, but he had to speak in the accent, in a vernacular accent from the slave plantation. And he had to stick to an agreed story, which his white abolitionist handler gave to him, rather than extemporize, rather than talk for himself. As he later recounted in his second volume, My Bondage and My Freedom, he was told by his AASS organizer just to, quote, give us the facts, which includes his body's testimony, in other words, his scars. And the society will, quote, take care of the philosophy. So we'll speak for you, just give us the facts, just give us the facts. This meant that he was introduced at meetings, in Douglas's words, and this is in the second volume, as a chattel, a thing, a piece of Southern property, with the audience assured that it could speak. To convince his disbelieving audience, given his intellect and his articulacy, he had to talk like a slave. This is a quote from him. Talk like a slave, look like a slave, act like a slave. He had to perform slavery. But after 4 months of repeating a mediated script, Douglas concluded that it did not entirely satisfy me to narrate wrongs. I felt like denouncing them. I could not always curb my moral indignation. So he began to move away from this kind of constraint. Whereas his first narrative concerned his freedom from enslavement and tells the story of how he escaped to the north, the second concerned his social and political liberation from the Anti-Slavery Society from Garrison and others. So the irony here, not lost on Douglas, is that the AASS, above all, wished Douglas to demonstrate that the enslaved were human beings, like any other American citizen. And obviously the whole abolitionist movement was to give them citizenship. But to reinforce this argument, Douglas had to perform his slave self, chattel thing, property, which denied his humanity, or at least his considerable independence of mind. So Douglas's first narrative associated himself with a redeemed Christ figure, a glorious resurrection, as we heard, from the tomb of slavery. But the second narrative, he became a black Moses figure, an independent leader and advocate on behalf of the enslaved in general, and hence his title, My Bondage and My Freedom. So Moses led out the people of Israel as slaves from Egypt, my bondage and my freedom. So he became this kind of much more active Moses figure. Okay, let's go a couple more on, slide 12. So this is Levi and slavery. So again, am I all right for time? Okay, good. Good. So again, we'll go through a little bit of Levi's bibliography. Have you read any Levi? Yes. So people have read some Levi, yeah? Good. Almost all, yes. Well, it's all there now in the collected edition, you can see. Okay. Now, Levi, what we need to know, the same as Douglas, is the variety of texts which Levi published. So we have testimony, if this is a man. Poetry, more testimony. We have hybrid text, the periodic table. Very hard to say what the periodic table is. Novels, if not now, the wrench. Search for Roots, again, another hybrid text. Drowned and the Saved, essays. And we now have the complete works. We also have a scientific Auschwitz report, which I'll talk about. And what I want to do actually is just highlight the first three. So you can see the dates, 46, 47, and 47. So in the first 2 years that he returned home after his 11 months in Auschwitz-Monowitz, he wrote 3 different kinds of texts. So the first was a medical treatise, collected poems at first, mainly distributed to friends and family, although they did also were published at the beginning of If This Is a Man, which is his testimony, written at the time. So you can see again, poetry, testimony, science. So that whole spectrum. And the reason that he's writing these different kinds of texts is he's looking for a voice. He's looking for a way, a vocabulary, a way of being able to represent his experience. And so he does it in different ways, through his poetry, through science, and mainly through testimony. But the testimony as well ranges from drama through to scientific, objective testimony. He described the poems as bloody poems, so there's a great deal of emotion in these poems, a lot less, well, none in Auschwitz report, and a lot less in If This Is a Man. Now, no one until now has explored what Levi's experience of slavery meant to him. Okay, let's go to the next slide. Okay, so this is something quite new. I've been working on Levi. Well, I taught the first Holocaust testimony course in the UK, so that was in the 80s. So that's when I first started teaching Levi. And I started writing on him in about the 90s. My claim to fame is that, and why I know it's the first, is that WG, and this is why I'm so old, but WG Seybold wrote to me and asked me for my, he was teaching it at UEA, and asked for my curriculum. So that letter, if I have nothing else, that letter will be enough. Um, so when I was asked to write another article, and I've written a lot, including a chapter in the diaspora book, you know, there was no point in doing it unless it was going to be new. But I also had to think, why has no one written about Levi and slavery? Levi was in a slave labor camp, Auschwitz-Monowitz. So he wasn't in Birkenau. Auschwitz was made up of 3 main camps. So the concentration camp, Auschwitz I, which if you visit Auschwitz, that's what you kind of see, which is the old, the brick where the soldiers were housed originally. Then Birkenau, which was the death camp. And then 4 miles away, this 12 miles, Auschwitz-Monowitz, the slave labor camp. That's where Levi was. So I think one reason why no one's written about Levi and slavery before now is that he became a symbol of Auschwitz. But of course, and as I say, he's the iconic European figure. When you think of Auschwitz, you think of Levi. If you want one kind of figure, there's lots more, obviously, survivors, but Levi became the iconic figure. And therefore, the association, even though he was 4 miles away, is with Birkenau, with the death camp, not with the slave labor camp or the forced labor camp. Levi, though, is clear about the differences between the 3 camps, and he makes it very clear in the preface to If This Is a Man, about his 11 months in Auschwitz-Monowitz. Now, it begins with his usual dry irony. So this is the first words that we read. It was my good fortune to be deported to Auschwitz only in 1944. Only Primo Levi could begin an account of being 11 months in Auschwitz with, it was my good fortune. Now, less often remarked is the historical context that accompanies Levi's irony as he was selected for the satellite camp Monowitz-Buna, or Auschwitz III. So as he says, after the German government had decided, because of the scarcity of labor, to lengthen the average lifespan of the prisoners destined for elimination. So that's why he was captured as a Jewish political prisoner. He had a red and yellow star. He thought that it was better to tell the Nazis when he was captured that he was Jewish. He was captured as a partisan, as an anti-fascist fighter. By the end of the war, there were over 1,000 satellite camps throughout Europe, which Levi rightly categorized, and this is the last quote here, as a single monstrous web of slave camps. So there were a single monstrous web of slave camps. Now, these satellite camps were hastily set up in 1944 to provide forced labor for the armaments industry and the SS Business and Administration Main Office, WVHA, to alleviate the dire state of the German war effort. By 1944, there were more prisoners in satellite camps than the main camps. 30% of the workforce in the German Reich was coerced labor and contributed to what Levi repeatedly called a slave economy. Now, Levi was selected for Monowitz-Buna and became what he called a self-described slave, which remained a consistent identification from its first usage in If This Is a Man. So this is about 37 pages in the Italian edition. So we're slaves, deprived of every right, exposed to every insult, condemned to certain death, but we still possess one power, and we must defend it with all our strength, for it is the power to refuse our consent. So straight away, he thinks of himself as a slave. One of the strange things to his unaccustomed ear is learning from his barracks inmate, Steinlauf, when first entering Monowitz, that he was a slave. 15 years after his liberation, he understood perfectly where Monowitz-Buna fitted into the slave economy. And we have a quote here, I think the third quote, according to my thing. No, it's not on there. I don't think it's there. No, I don't think so. Okay. He says that if fascism had prevailed, the whole of Europe would have been transformed into a complex system of forced labor camps and extermination camps. So he understood the Nazi project, and the Nazi project included both genocide, so it had a racial hierarchy. So at the bottom, you kill off the Roma and Jews. Above them, you have the Slavs as slave labor, and that was their vision for Europe. Essentially, Hitler thought if Britain could have Africa and Asia, if America could have the whole of North America, I'm going to have Europe. And this was his vision for Europe. The Buna rubber factory in Monowitz was an industrial complex that covered 12 square miles, 12 square miles. Levi described it as big as a city, he said, and it was the most ambitious plant of its kind in the Third Reich. It was much larger in size than Auschwitz-Birkenau. So any of you that have been to Auschwitz-Birkenau, imagine how big it is. It was built by IG Farben, a pharmaceutical conglomerate, which was one of the biggest corporations in Europe, and it still exists today. So that whole industrial complex just became a part of the Stalinist economy and now the Polish economy. Even after the Nuremberg war trials, it exists in different companies. Its subsidiaries made Cyclone B gas, which enabled the industrialized murder in Auschwitz too, in Birkenau. IG Farben negotiated with the SS the rations for its forced workers, the need for an infirmary, where Levi was there more than once, and also a brothel, and even the location of the ruthless beatings of its mainly Jewish slave laborers. So IG Farben said, don't beat them in public, not in front of the non-Jewish inmates. This is where you beat them. Although owned by IG Farben, Monowitz was indistinguishable from other camps and included the bitterly sarcastic sign, Arbeit macht frei, which the SS ensured welcomed all new prisoners. At the start of the truce, Levi described these three mocking words, as he put it, as the gateway of slavery. Each laborer was expected to live no more than 3 months, based on their starvation rations, vicious treatment, and overwork. The labor force in the concentration camp was not a stock, but a flow, which Levi, in his preface to To the Drowned and the Saved, his essays called, quote, a bottomless pool of ever-replenished slave labor. In the preface to the school's edition of If This Is a Man, Levi foregrounded the role of slave labor in Auschwitz and the Nazi regime so that it could be understood by future generations. So this was written for a school's edition. And Levi, Anna. So Levi spent a lot of time speaking to schools in Italy and wrote journalism and also spoke to Catholic groups as well. So this was the kind of expectations that he had. But in the school's edition, he said in 1944, there were at least 9 million forced slave laborers in Germany, which indicates the intimate bond between German heavy industry and the administration of the camps, the lagers. Certainly, it was not a coincidence that of all places, Auschwitz was chosen as the site of the enormous industrial plants of Buna. This was a return to a pharaonic economy, and at the same time, a wise planning decision. It was manifestly desirable for the grand works and the slave camps to be side by side. Now, it's typical of Levi to juxtapose the ancient pharaonic economy. So we talked about the Israelites in Egypt, ruled by the pharaohs, slaves built the pyramids, etc. But what he does is he juxtaposes the pharaonic economy with the modernizing Germans. The modernizing Germans, a wise planning decision. So you have the ancient and the modern coming together. And here we have a sense of the history of slavery going back to antiquity and up to modernity. He described himself as a chemist slave, as being in a laboratory with two other specialist prisoners, like the educated slaves whom the rich Romans imported from Greece. So he looked at these ancient examples of slavery and thought of himself in those terms. He repeatedly stated that Monovitz-Buna was divided between masters and slaves, and this is a phrase he uses all the time, which is a universal rupture going back, as I say, to the Greco-Roman civilization, the Israelite slaves in Egypt, at the disposal of the pharaonic economy. So he had this timeless view of slavery. But this timelessness also reinforces an unending sense of trauma. Slide 14, please. Okay, so now we're looking at commonalities. Monovitz included many prisoners of war and civilizations, which made Levi all too conscious of how he was perceived by others. Before he became what he called a chemist slave, he was also an ignoble slave, as he put it, who supposedly spoke in what he called animal noises, without hair, without honor, without names, beaten every day, more abject every day. In his later essays, he spoke consistently of a fascism that, quote, had made us into slaves, branded us like beasts. And this follows Douglas's definition of slavery. The condition of a slave is simply that of a brute beast, Douglas said. In Shame, Levi characterized people in the camps as living like enslaved animals. And in Useless Violence, another essay, he described, and this is the first quote, his tattooed number as akin to the mark branded on the slaves and on livestock being sent to slaughter. So this is exactly the same language as Douglas. In another essay, which he called Arbeit macht frei, Levi described the Nazi project to enslave the European continent as a form of animalization and racialization. So this is a second quote. So this just reinforces what I said earlier. But what it shows is Levi's absolute understanding of the Nazi project, including both genocide and slavery. The slaves in general, and the Russians in particular, will be enslaved and subjected to a carefully planned regimen of biological degradation that would transform them into useful beasts of burden, illiterate, so he understood, you heard what I said about Douglas, devoid of any initiative, incapable of rebellion or criticism. Douglas said much the same thing in the third quote. The nature of slavery. The slave is a human being divested of all rights, reduced to the level of brute, placed beyond the circle of human brotherhood. That's from his second testimony. Levi's correctly anticipating a future Nazi racial hierarchy based on past histories of the slave plantations, combined with his understanding of what he calls several millions of foreigners in conditions of enslavement in the final months of the war, as I said, around 9 million. In a 1979 lecture called Racial Intolerance, Levi looked at the origins of the history of the transatlantic slave trade and noted, and this is the final quote, the number mentioned, though it's hard to confirm, is about 50 million slaves deported across the Atlantic after the discovery of America. So he began to think of his own experience in this much wider historical way. Okay, let's go for we're coming up to the end. We're on the final track. Poetry. Both Levi and Douglas used biblical language, and we've heard this in both. Douglas was a believer, a believing Christian. Douglas was more of a humanist, but he did use biblical language, but in a secular way, a bit like Bob Dylan uses biblical language, which refers, as I say, to the enslaved children of Israel. And this poem is called Passover. So this is a first stanza from Passover, where he's looking at the Jewish tradition of Passover, where you have to remember that you were once a slave, and you have to empathize with the stranger and with slavery. It's that ethical tradition that at the moment has been thrown out of the window. But let's just talk about Levi's poem. Each of us has been a slave in Egypt, has soaked straw and clay with sweat, and crossed the sea with dry feet. You too, stranger, this year in fear and shame, next year in strength and justice. Now, this is a humanist rewriting. What religious Jews would say at the Passover ceremony is next year in Jerusalem. But he's broadened this out. Next year in strength and justice, this year in fear and shame. This poem, I think, very much speaks to our present condition. So Levi's suffering following the Passover traditions, each of us has been a slave in Egypt, is also our suffering. You too, stranger. You too, stranger. Douglas also evoked the festival of Passover in his lectures as it celebrates what he called the emancipated people of God from slavery. As I say, he constructed himself as this Black Moses figure and was seen as that. Now, given such overlapping vocabularies, have you a sense of who wrote the poem? So this is a stanza from this poem, The Last Epiphany. Epiphany. Do you know the word epiphany? You nodded? So it's from the Catholic tradition mainly. What would you say? Kind of revelation?
She's pregnant.
That's one epiphany, yes. And Joyce, James Joyce, if you've read any James Joyce, he's my hero, along with Levi. He was not pregnant, but he did see the world in relation to epiphanies. Okay, so let's read this. Who wrote this? And I came as a prisoner, as a slave in chains, to be sold, to be whipped. You turned your back on the livid slave in rags. Now I come to judge. Do you recognize me now? I think this is a very powerful stanza. And in condensed form, we have the whole lecture. So we have the image both of the abject slave in chains, who we can't look at, an unbearable sight, and the detached judge, who's all too recognizable, and we can stand back, be detached, and just look for the facts. So such is the split between the testimonial language of law and scientific objectivity and the traumatized language of individual suffering. So in condensed form, we have it in this poem. Who do you think wrote it? Douglas or Levi? I ask this every time I give this talk, so I'm just curious. Any ideas? Douglas, we've got one for Douglas, one for Levi. Okay, hands up for Douglas. Okay, a few hands up for Douglas. Hands up for Levi. Okay, so Levi's in the minority. It's actually Levi. But it's interesting, we don't know. And I ask it at every lecture, and usually I have to say, people say Douglas. So no shame there.
I was thinking Levi and several. I thought they were two separate poems.
Yeah, they are. So this is Levi's poem, Passover. This is another Levi poem, but I was playing games with the second one. Okay. Because that's Primo Levi. Yeah. Because what Primo Levi did is take biblical language and humanize it, secularize it. Yeah. For the second, I mean, that's what most people do. And that's why it's interesting for me.
We could have Googled.
Of course you could have Googled it. But we always Google, and Google, you know, we don't need God anymore. We've got Google. So, okay. Final slide. We're on the conclusion. Okay, I'm not sure how long I've spoken for, but anyway. Okay. Now, these are concluding remarks and maybe a way of generating some kind of discussion. There's much, obviously, that I haven't discussed in this talk. And that's why I'm writing a kind of book, a kind of brief history or short history or condensed history of testimony and just trying to think of testimony as a genre to make these kinds of connections. But I'd be more than happy to address other issues in the Q&A. We've looked at two exceptional men, and exceptional is their word. So they're well aware that they're exceptional for lots of reasons. Levi said famously, "We the survivors are not the true witnesses." He was well aware that most people, even in Monowitz, most people that he knew that were in the camp would have died. As I say, 3 months was their lifespan. He had a couple of things going for him, Levi. Good fortune, as he says. There were Italian civilians there that fed him, Lorenzo, and he was a qualified chemist and passed a chemistry exam. But within the first month or so, he easily could have died. He was in the infirmary, and the infirmary was usually a death sentence. But anyway, he didn't. And he says, "We, the survivors, are not the true witnesses." So he understood that he was exceptional. When we focus on individual accounts, where does that leave the collective or the collected? He was also well aware that he's speaking for people that can't speak for themselves. Douglas, the same, that the vast majority of survivors from the slave plantations didn't write slave narratives. I said there's 100 were produced, but of those 100, very few were written in the actual voice. They were written by ghostwriters. So Douglas was also exceptional and became an exceptional figure. In the end, he became a senator and a diplomat. He became quite exceptional. Okay, but there are men as well. So this raises the question of gender and the link between gender and genre. And I think there is a link here. Up until the 1980s, so this is 150 years after Douglas's first testimony and 50 years after Levi's, these male figures were mistakenly read as universal. So what we could think of as the universal masculine, the universal male figure, and as being representative. And they were not. So the discovery of Harriet Jacobs' essential slave narrative in the 1970s and incidents in the life of a slave girl. So that was the 1970s, as I say, 150 years after. Douglas began to counter that sense of the male universal. And the first conference on women in the Holocaust was the 1980s, I think. So that 78, okay, changed that perception. So the point that I want to make in my conclusion is that the hard, factual, objective definition of testimony is gendered and biased, I think, towards the universalized male voice. And that's something we can discuss. This is just a theory of mine. These are readerly expectations. So these expectations of how we write testimony, what testimony is, I think we have to overcome today. And testimony is written today and uses the same genre as the past. So we have to question those expectations. And on that note, I'll finish. Thank you.
So that first we give a chance to the people online to ask.
Yes.
Because otherwise I will forget them.
Yes.
And then you can guys think.
So think about any question you want to ask.
Sorry, I don't want to speak next to you because then they can hear me. Or you can talk to them and invite Peter and Christine if they have questions.
Okay, so Peter and Christine.
Do you have questions?
Questions?
Yes, Christine has a question.
Good, okay. So a question from Christine.
Yeah, let me try to switch on. Before I have a ton of questions. First of all, thanks very much. That was wonderful and you know, so rich on all these different aspects that are also worth discussing at much greater length. Before I ask any question, I just wanted to basically ask share an experience about the power of testimony because it's so fresh in my mind and because it links to what you said at the very beginning about the horrendous situation in Israel and Gaza and this war between the two communities. Like yesterday was Memorial Day in Israel, right? And there is always an alternative Memorial Day celebration, as some of you might know, organized by an organization called Combatants for Peace. That's former IDF soldiers and former Palestinian fighters who now work together for peace, like protecting communities in the West Bank, demonstrating, things like that. And also the parents, what's it called? Parent Circle, no. Yeah, Parent Circle Family Forum, I think, or Family Circle. No, yeah, that way around. So that's families who lost family members to the conflict again from both sides. And so they do this joint memorial event, Israeli and Palestinian, that now has to be held in a non-disclosed location because of fear of attacks from basically the right in both, communities. But it's extremely powerful, and it's basically people sharing their loss and their pain and their desire to overcome this conflict for precisely that reason. And so they had it was sort of live streamed. It's still available online, so I really recommend it. It's a very powerful example for testimony. And the camera every now and then. So there was a location in the West Bank and a hall in Israel, and in the Israeli location you had a mixed community of Israeli Arabs and Israeli Jews, and in the West Bank I assume it will mostly have been Palestinians. But the camera every now and then sort of panned the crowd, right, when people were giving their testimonies and their talks, and you could kind of see how these stories reached people in both communities and really created a kind of shared awareness of humanity and suffering, I think. And so I thought this was a really, I mean, amid all this horror and hopelessness, a real kind of spark of where maybe new things sort of could begin. And both those organizations are actually at the moment growing quite strongly. So I think, yeah, for me that was just one example I now have for testimony and what it does actually.
No, I couldn't agree more, and I think you've put your finger on a point of optimism that eventually we'll have to get there, where the communities en masse can speak to each other. Being a bit of an old curmudgeon, I'll just give you a slight counter to that, which is when these events are disclosed, and it was disclosed at one place in Israel, you have extremists, Kahanist, right-wingers, egged on by the government, breaking them up.
Yeah, absolutely.
So at the moment, it shows how powerful they are, because even a Palestinian voice or a Palestinian flag at the moment is too much. So, but it does show what needs to be done and what will have to grow in the future. Absolutely.
I'm sure we have comments and questions from the audience here.
Okay, so nothing from Peter.
Well, he had his shot.
Okay, all right. Okay, so I'll turn around.
No, isn't it?
I have a question.
Yes, a question.
My dear friend and esteemed colleague Alexandra Garbarina has been working on the emergence of the mass genocides, and the 20th example of the Ukrainian massacres and Armenian genocide. And she historicizes the way how people talked about the Shoah was born in early 1920s. So I want to tease you, since you have such a big historical leap, and of course Jewish studies sit here in history, and you come from English, and we love our colleagues from English, but you are a little bit a different beast. Would be, if you think about the differences in the legacy of thinking about mass atrocity from people who survived the slavery in the south of the US up to Levy, what are the important historical developments, how we think about mass atrocity testimony, are there according to you, since you are the expert?
Okay. I was trained both in history and literature, but I admit that I'm looking at canonical writers, and also the kinds of writers that would be considered literary, and that's very much a tension within testimonial studies. My focus is not on the specific history of the events. All historical events are different. I'm not in any way saying that slave plantations and the slave labor in the Nazi was the same. And historians have written volumes on the differences between the two. But what I am saying is that testimony is a genre, and it's the generic limits. It's like a realist novel, or it's the constraints within the genre of testimony, and therefore I would look at events where testimony is produced. And if it's not produced, then you have to think why. So, for instance, the Ukrainian massacre within the Russian Civil War, I'm not aware of popular canonical testimonies from that, but that might well be my ignorance. Are there?
There are, and I want to be clear, I'm not talking about the historical events.
No.
We know that throughout the early 20th century, people start talking about the first genocide, and they have a set of expectations what they should include. And you also talked about 1970s and crisis of second wave feminism, and since then we use sexual assault to mark an experience of genocide. And then have new markers. So the way how we testify about horrible events is always a social construction. So in a way, it would be interesting to see how in the big leap from 1850, from Douglas to 1950 at Levy, what are the big changes in this strange genre that is testimony about horrible things? Because people think about how they narrate. We always narrate towards a set of listeners.
Yes. I mean, genocide isn't necessarily the right term, because slave narratives wasn't a genocide in that sense. I mean, it was a lot of things, but I think to call it a genocide is ahistorical. But I think you're right. I think I would need to look, say, at the Armenian genocide as an example. I would need to look at slavery elsewhere, for sure, throughout the world. Rwanda, absolutely. So I haven't yet made up my mind, and I am being, in that sense, literary about it. I want to first of all think about canonical testimonies. Why are some testimonies heard, and why are the vast majority not? So what does it mean? Why are these testimonies heard? So what work do they do? What work do they do for people with power, actually? Quite often. So quite often they're appropriated. And as I say, they have to write in relation to certain expectations. If you write completely ignoring expectations, then even if you're published, you'll be published by a tiny publisher and have no real resonance. So those are the kinds of issues that I'm interested in. So I'll look certainly at other histories and you know, at testimonies that are heard and that we hear today. Also, new slave narratives today is a genre that we need to think about. Contemporary testimonies, I think, after Gaza, it will be impossible now not to hear Palestinian voices. So I need to think about, you know, readerships for me is important, reception for me is important. So those are the questions that I would put next to historical events.
Very simple question. Because you mentioned testimony, and it's a kind of norm. So it's a kind of the creation process. So I would like to see how much the history, how much testimony is history, and how much history is fiction. And if as a historian in our future works, we need to use the stuff in the testimony works. How can we prove the validity of that recording in the testimony works?
Yeah, that's an unbelievably difficult question. That's not, but it's a great question. And this is why I try my best to work both within literature and history, because this is so. Quite often, novels will be written using documentary testimony to give them authority. So there'll be novels with fictional characters, but they will include historical evidence, documentary evidence, to give them some kind of historical. So there isn't a simple divide. There's a blurring between literature and history. As I say, both Douglas and Levi, but also all canonical writers will use their experience, document their experience, but also narrativize it, turn it into literature, turn it into something that's interesting for people to read, or dramatic, or worth reading. It won't simply be a collection of facts. And the great example of that, there's lots of examples, but one the easily recognized example is Elie Wiesel. So Elie Wiesel wrote a version of Night. So if we read Night, Wiesel's Night. So in America, that's taught in high schools, and that's their kind of Anne Frank's diary. So it's high school kids all read it, and it's a little book, first published in French, then in English. But before it was a little book, it was a big book in Yiddish, while the world remained silent. And it was written in this documentary tradition, this memory book, memory bocha, this Yiddish tradition for other survivors, other Yiddish readers, but simply documented what was destroyed in a particular town. So he had a particular town in Hungary destroyed, and he documents it. But it's never been translated, because what it is a factual account, a documentary account of what was destroyed. Night is this massive worldwide bestseller because it's a literary text. Night is a metaphor. It's the relationship between him and father and son. It Christianizes to a large extent. It's written in a vocabulary. Remember, audiences in Europe were mainly Christian audiences. So the Yiddish-speaking readerships that he wrote the first book for, they're tiny. You know, it was a South American press that published it, and a few escaped to South America. Whereas a mass readership is either Catholic or Protestant. And so it uses that kind of vocabulary. It's the same experience, the same events, but written in completely different ways. So this raises questions, as you say, of facticity, documentary evidence, authenticity. Now, all of these questions are the reason why I taught my course for 35 years, 40 years. So these are big, big questions, but they're not simple answers. So novels will use history to gain authenticity. Testimonies, documentary testimonies, will use literary strategies to gain readerships. Otherwise, they're not read. So you can see this. It works in quite a complicated way.
Yeah, that might be a historical test, but like you were saying, you were comparing the government and Levi, they're like canonical and I guess kind of your, well, at least how I understood your point is that Levi is a canonical writer, but not for what he wrote about slavery, whilst Douglas is canonical and heard for what he wrote about slavery. So
Yeah.
it's like, I would say, observing kind of one canonical slave experience writer and help understand the other, and he kind of
And that's a good question, yeah.
Yeah.
I think I brought them together because no one, as I say, had written about Levi and the fact that he was in a slave labor camp and he thought of himself as a slave. But once I read Levi in those terms, and once I understood that Levi thought of himself and wrote constantly about himself in those terms, it was helpful for me to go back to Douglas. Douglas is seen as the representative voice. You know, as I say, that's a limitation in very much in gender terms, because he's a representative masculine voice, if anything. But it then helped me to compare it with Levi, because then I could see all kinds of similarities. And I think, especially in relation to their both of them using the spectrum from soft to hard definitions of testimony. And I think that's probably what distinguishes canonical writers in the end, that they use the full spectrum of testimony. So it's not just a novel, it's not just literature, which we can dismiss as just the imagination or empathy, but it's not just documentary facts. It's the full spectrum. It's looking for different voices, different vocabularies, different ways of understanding their experience. And very self-conscious. Self-conscious tends to be a word which writers then end up in the canon. But it's very self-conscious about what vocabulary they're choosing, why they're choosing it, and moving all the time in their text from the experience of a beating, and then thinking, in Douglas's case, especially after reading best-selling fiction by women writers, then bringing in his relationship with his mother, all kinds of emotional dimension to it. But it was very useful for me once I wanted to read Levi in these terms, understood that he himself thought of him, wrote in these terms, but then to compare it with Douglas, kind of established Levi as writing slave narrative testimonies as well as camp testimonies. Thank you.
I have a brief comment from Peter Davis.
Yes, Peter.
Hi, yeah, thank you so much. This is really, really brief. I know time is passing. Thank you so much for your talk. I thought that comparison was really interesting. I just wanted to add something quickly to what you said about Elie Wiesel and that early Yiddish version of the testimony that had never been translated. It actually is being translated now. It's being translated into German. And there's a German version of that will be out relatively soon, I think. I don't know exactly when. It's part of the new German complete works of Wiesel that's being produced by the Elie Wiesel Research Centre in Tübingen. And I think that will make a huge difference to how Wiesel is read and received. I think these questions of translation and reception and retranslation, of course, are fascinating. And I could go on about that for hours and hours and hours, but I won't. But they've retranslated Night as well. So we now have 2 German translations, as we have 2 English translations for it as well. So I think that just to add that to what you're saying, I don't have anything more to say, but no, thank you so much.
I think that's really interesting, and working in the way I do, I work a lot with language specialists. So Germanists in terms of John Amare, Italianists obviously in terms of Levi, French specialists in terms of Charlotte Delbo. What will interest me about this, Wiesel was unbelievably nervous when Naomi Seidman quoted the Yiddish. And in a way, that's why we have the second English translation, where he brings in the Yiddish version. And we'll just have to see what kind of translation it is. And we'll need people to compare the original with the German, I think, because there's all kinds of stuff to do with revenge in the Yiddish original,